begin, let me say a few words about King's Think Tank. King's Think Tank is the biggest student-led policy institute of its kind in Europe. As many of you have hopefully noticed, we are working to put on a great variety of panels with high-profile speakers on a great variety of events. And this is to give our students a chance to learn more about pressing policy issues and to create a dialogue between students, policymakers, and experts on various topics such as foreign policy, energy and environment, healthcare, education, law, and many more. Moreover, and this is very important, we are asking students to contribute to actual problem solving by generating policy recommendations, which will not only be lobbied for, but which will also be published in our journal, The Spectrum, at the end of each academic year. If you would like to get involved, please apply until the 14th of March for the Defense and Diplomacy Policy Center's Policy Roundtable on radicalization. The Policy Roundtable will be held on the 21st of March, and you can find the link to the application form on the Facebook event page, but you can also ask me or Matthew, who's sitting right here in front, if you have any further questions. In the application, we value most of the section where you tell us about your policy recommendation or your idea for one. So, tonight we will be talking about Islamic radicalization in Europe. More than 5,000 to 6,000 Europeans have already joined Daesh, or the so-called Islamic State, in Iraq and Syria. After the terrorist attacks last year, in, for example, in Tunisia and Beirut, but in particular after Paris, the fear of more jihad terrorist attacks across Europe has grown. Therefore, we are wondering what leads to violent radicalization. In every case, there is a large group of young people alienated beyond usual frustrations of youth. It could be poverty, but it is as likely to be discrimination, a clash of generations, or cultural rejection. Crucially, they feel no voice. They feel they have no voice and little stake in a wider society. Also, there will be a clear cause, possibly legitimate, but maybe romantic, which offers identity, meaning, and purpose. It might be national liberation, self-determination, religious expression, or class conflict. But at its core are seen wrongs needing to be put right. But we'll talk more about that. In the UK, a key part of the government's counter-terrorism, counter-radicalization strategy is a program called PREVENT, which has been in place for over a decade. It is aimed at stopping more people getting drawn towards violent extremism. In 2015, more than 3,800 people have been reported to referred to the government's anti-radicalization program, which is more than twice the number in 2014. The program is controversial, and more generally, the UK's policy strategies, because as it might increase racial profiling and exacerbate Islamophobia. Should it or should it not be students and lecturers' responsibility to report on extremism or people showing signs of it? And if a student has radicalized, which approach of de-radicalization should be taken? Therefore, we should ask ourselves three questions. First of all, how can we explain Islamist radicalization? Secondly, how can the government tackle radicalization without fostering it? And thirdly, how can we address racial and religious prejudice and stigmatization? We have the honor to welcome two experts on these issues on our panel. One of the intended speakers has informed us this afternoon that he got ill, Dr. Benedict Wilkinson, but I'm sure we're going to have an in-depth discussion with our other two speakers. So let me introduce Emman El-Badawy, who is the author of Inside the Jihadi Mind, which I've also shared with all of you. And she is also a senior analyst for the Center on Religion and Geopolitics. She has been the 2014 BBC Expert Voice on speakers will give a short 10 to 15-minute introduction to their to specific aspects, and they will be very happy to answer your questions in the question and answer session in the end. So with no further ado, I would like to ask you to begin by talking about Islamist radicalization, how Islamist radicalization can inform the response to counter radicalization. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. Is this working? I've always had problems with mics. Can you all hear me?
Yeah.
Great. Okay, well, I guess I'm going to focus on the ideology aspect because that's what my research is mostly focused on over the last few years. And time again, I get asked by various people, explain Islamic radicalization, or what's the root cause of Islamic radicalization? And I always fight back the urge to say it's complicated, because that's exactly what journalists expect you to say as an academic or anyone working in this field. And that's not what they want to hear. They want to hear simplicity. But the truth is, people are complicated. And when you work in counter-extremism, other than counter-terrorism, you're not dealing with numbers, you're not dealing with threats, you're dealing with people, individuals and their complex lives. And so, in that sense, it is complicated. So many of us, researchers in this field, have trawled through databases on jihadis, looking at some of the most prominent jihadis, to understand, based on their biographies and their lives, what made them join jihadi groups and what drew them towards extremism, with the hope of finding some kind of clear trend that we could say, this is what caused their extremism. We've had so many theories on why these groups have formed and why these people get appeal. We've had grievance-based theories. Historically, we've always seen Islamist groups and jihadi networks as social movements in a way. And so this has always informed some of our understanding, this idea that people have grievances and basically these groups offer solutions. We've also had the mindset theory, this idea that people have specific mindsets, that you go through a specific discipline in life, which is what's drawn people towards doing some research into educational backgrounds of some researchers, of some jihadis, sorry. I think one of the famous ones is understanding the engineering aspect and the fact that so many engineers in the Middle East have been drawn towards jihad. We've also had the foreign policy argument, that it's foreign policies that draw people towards radicalization. And we've also had the theological argument that looks at the fact that Islam is being used as a tool to radicalize people. Despite all of these theories, we're still trying to see a trend that we can say, this is what causes someone's journey towards radicalization. And none of these research objectives have ever found the answer to one common denominator that's shared with all people across the world who have joined these groups. And these groups have attracted people across the world. So we're not just talking about Middle Eastern jihadis, but also we're talking about people from Europe, which is what we're here to talk about today. So in that sense, the only common denominators that we've ever found with this whole exercise has been the fact that most of them are men, although that is changing, and also all of them identify as Muslims. And this is really what's caused the whole debate over how Islamic is ISIS, for instance. Now, what this failure to identify any common trends between different jihadis has actually told us is that there really is no prototype. There's not that prototype jihadi that offers one journey towards radicalization. Everyone has very different journeys, different reasons for joining these groups. And this has really come down to the whole it's complicated argument. We've identified a few reasons why people join these groups and why they would be attracted to it, and it goes down to the theories I mentioned earlier. But every single jihadi has a unique journey. And then understanding how that then translates into such a homogenous network of people into the global jihadi movement, all fighting towards one common objective. They all go in being very unique, but they come out actually being very similar to each other, using the same language, having the same enemy, having the same objective, having the same collective history. They can come from multiple different ethnic backgrounds, but suddenly they have collective history. They start to develop a worldview based on the same lens. And for me, that's really the key to understanding the appeal of these groups. Because, to be honest with you, something about this, how they managed to make quite a unique group of people into a homogeneous movement, all working together for the same cause, is for me the answer to how we end up offering a counter-narrative. Because that is an ideology that we're trying to fight. So how this seemingly monolithic movement across the world is attracting so many different people and creating such similar people out of it is, for me, what I went in to do the research for inside the Jihadi Mind, to understand what is it about this ideology that ends up appealing to so many different people. So with the report, I think it's nice to know that you guys have all received a copy of it. So I'm not going to go into too much detail because I trust that all of you can read that yourself. But essentially what we're trying to do is break it down, break that ideology down. Everyone keeps talking about Salafi, Jihadi ideology, and understand what is it in that ideology that's attracting people. So we broke it down into values, we broke it down into objectives, into conduct, and into identity. Essentially, the values were really dominant in the ideology that we were looking at. So we were using propaganda as our main source of understanding what the ideology is. And the rationale behind that is that if we only look at official propaganda, that means we can get an idea of what these groups want their members to believe. There's a lot of unofficial propaganda that gets disseminated, but official propaganda is the stuff that really helps you understand what is the message being taught to members, what do they want members to believe, and what do they want new recruits to believe as well. How do they view themselves within their movement? One of the most dominant aspects of ideology was the values section. A lot of people find that very difficult to understand because this is a violent network. It's a group of people that just want to kill people, right? Why do they have values? What value is that? But actually, the values bit are really important because what you actually found was that this was their moral basis. This is how they legitimised what they did. And this is so important to a group that can end up being very, very controversial. Actually, what was really interesting was that we coded the themes on an ad hoc basis. We didn't go in knowing what we were going to find. And so in that sense, when we came across some really predominant positive values, we had to code that because that was so interesting. Understanding how they use values such as honour. This is something that we all aspire to being, honourable. But they were using honour as that was an example of what they did. That was the highest point of their value base. Solidarity with the oppressed. So always looking at the underdog, fighting for the underdogs in the world. That was another really important aspect. And these are values that so many heroes and different fictional characters end up possessing. And so they're creating this really romanticised idea of a hero. You also we found a lot of Islamic creedal values. And these were values that almost every single practicing Muslim values in their life. They're foundational beliefs. So things like faith, Iman, or, and my namesake, or ihsan, which is to do charity. And these are things that almost all religions value. But Islam values it as a pillar, a real high level of belief. Now, these are really mainstream Islamic creedal values, which you cannot deny the role that Islam played in how they were building their moral basis. But these values, these creedal Islamic values, yes, they were mainstream, but they were being applied in very non-mainstream ways. So they were all targeted towards justifying jihad. And at the end, jihad was considered the most important practice of worship a Muslim could do, which is definitely not mainstream for Muslims. Jihad is not more important than prayer. But throughout the propaganda, the readers were being told that jihad is more important than prayer. So in that sense, it was really applied in a non-mainstream way. But yes, Islam did play a big part, and that goes into the identity and how they see themselves. They see themselves as Muslims. And so any kind of counter-narrative will have to acknowledge the way that Islamic creedal values have been used in the propaganda to legitimise the actions, the objective, and just generally the belief structure. Another aspect of which is quite interesting is the conduct area. So we looked at a lot of the how they considered this was all about how do groups decide what actions are permissible on the battlefield. This is a big aspect of how different groups in the battlefield tend to fight with each other. This is a big bone of contention between ISIS and Jihadi Mind in Syria, for instance, where they tend to do a lot of arguments and rhetoric that fights about who's more merciful and sort of actions that are not permissible, for instance, targeting civilians. But chivalry and mercy came up a lot. So these young men, through this propaganda, were being made to believe that they were being chivalric and they were merciful in what they were doing. And that's really important because you would expect that there would be a lot more emphasis on suicide bombs and, targeting civilians, but actually there was a lot more emphasis on positive aspects of conduct. Things that you would expect a knight in shining armour to portray. I also think a big aspect of it was how they created their identity structure. Now this was universal. They didn't stipulate who was part of the group. It was all very broad, so it meant that it was such a universal group, a universal movement, which meant that anyone could really join them. And this was really important because they have to portray themselves as very open. Now, the most important findings that we found from the report was the fact that actually most of the content in the propaganda was not violence-based. And this shows that actually we need to move forward with our approach to countering the narrative as just being so negative and saying, this isn't right, this isn't moral, killing people is wrong in Islam, and all of this, which we always use. It's a knee-jerk reaction when you see a horrific act being spread across the media that ISIS has done or different groups have done. Actually, we're focusing very, very much on an area that they don't even bother to focus on. They moved on their narrative to start producing content that makes people believe that jihad is a spiritual endeavour. If we're going to try to challenge it, we have to start challenging that spiritual argument as well as the more violent argument. Another aspect that I think we really need to be honest about is the fact that yes, that debate about foreign policy and the role of foreign policy is there. And I don't believe that foreign policy alone draws someone towards radicalisation. But actually, you'd be disingenuous if you said that international policies were not being used as a mobilising factor. In fact, it is a massively compelling aspect to the propaganda. And we have to be honest about that. Young people get swept in, probably in their first basis of expressing a grievance is their grievance towards policies and politics. I don't believe you can become radicalised until you're first politicised. I guess moving forward, and just to wrap up, I think based on what we now know about the propaganda, I think an effective counter-narrative will approach a more localised level of counter-narrative. I think a lot of what we've done in the past is we've done a national approach to trying to promote British values. But actually, these groups, yes, they're a large global movement, and they're part of a massive movement across the world. But each group uses local grievances, local priorities that are important to local people to get attention, to get legitimacy. And their narratives are very focused on real specifics that are affecting the people. And they also build grievances that can maybe start as localised, but they become completely internationalised. You start off having a local grievance, but you apply it to your brothers and your sisters in different parts of the world who are part of your community, your global community. And so we do need to have a much better focus on a localised aspect. It's all very well to have a national approach, but we need to look at, I think the art to it is the effect and the influence individuals can have on their small social circles. We've noticed with the rise of Europeans going off to ISIS that actually they tend to, small social circles have ended up going off to fight in Iraq and Syria. You see new areas of the UK, Birmingham for instance, but also now Portsmouth, the areas that were not typically a big focus for Prevent, have ended up having to focus on new small towns where people have ended up going because friends they knew also went to ISIS. This is showing the fact that this is done through social circles. And so in countering it, those social circles, those tight networks of individuals who start to engage with Islamist extremism, end up being the real cause for radicalization. This is deeply personal networks. And the only way really to tackle it is if you get through those networks and start to create a counter-narrative that reaches those tight circles. I also think that our narratives need to be much more positive than they already are. It's all very well to do an anti or counter-narrative, but this focus on counter this, counter that, isn't really a compelling alternative for people. We really need to start building a much more positive message that people can start rallying behind. So many young people want to rally behind things. You need to give them something to rally behind. Give them something to live for, I suppose. And I think we also need to have a lot more of a humanistic approach to the way that we build our counter-narratives. A lot of building up this image of the enemy in propaganda is about dehumanizing the other. And I do think that a lot of counter-narrative can really work towards rehumanizing the enemy. So all of us in the room who, we don't support all the foreign policies of our country, it's not as simple as that. Or we've got loads of friends that are Muslims and lots of friends that are different religions, and that's just how we operate as a society. But actually, when you become so closed off and you become so inward-looking at your own social circles, it's very easy to become so blinkered that you don't see the realities on the ground, and that there's some really great people there that break that stereotype and that binary narrative. And I also think, and I think this will probably be touched on a little bit already, but we do need to look at far-right extremism as far-right extremism and Islamist extremism are two sides of the same coin. We cannot try to eradicate Islamist extremism unless we also try to eradicate far-right extremism, because they feed off each other. I think on that point, I will pass over.
Talk on mechanisms of racial
I'll be touching on that. Firstly, so before I begin, I'd just like to say thank you, please. Is it okay? Yeah. Firstly, thank you for organizing this discussion on such a pertinent issue, and thanks for inviting me to speak. What I'm going to say today will obviously echo some of the thoughts and views shared by my fellow panelists, but I'll probably be taking a different approach to maybe seeing prevent and prevent strategies and analysing that a little bit. But before I begin, I'll probably give a brief intro to my work. As some of you may or may not know, I'm a third-year PhD student in the War Studies Department right here at King's. And my thesis explores responses and reactions to being negatively stereotyped and stigmatized, so that's where the mechanisms come in, which I'll be talking about a little bit. So my two case studies, I look at contemporary Britain and Islamophobia and anti-Semitism in Weimar, Germany. That's probably left to a different discussion altogether, but what I'm going to be saying for the next 10 or so minutes is hugely informed by my work within Muslim communities in Britain. So I say communities because it's not a monolith. There's several different schemas and several different aspects to each sort of sub-community. This evening, I just want to highlight a few things regarding radicalization, in particular with an emphasis on Islamism in Britain today. So I'll begin with a brief outline of what the term radicalization means in this context, in policy and in practice. I'll then say a little bit about prevent strategy and evaluating its effectiveness. And I'll finish off by offering a few suggestions, essentially, on how to tackle radicalization without fostering it. As is the case with such debates, I think I'll probably end up posing more questions than answering them. But if I were to be sort of self-righteously proclaim that I have all the right answers here now, I wouldn't be a humble academic, I'd probably be an MP. So that's probably my career choice in a nutshell. Interestingly enough, while the term radicalization is bandied about and overused almost within policy, the definition is virtually exempt almost from counter-terror legislation, well, within the guideline documents. It is there, but it's equated to the term extremism, which, according to Prevent guidelines, is any vocal or active opposition to fundamental British values. As you can see, it's a pretty loaded term, and at the same time, it's quite loose. So already from this very beginning, we have this ambiguity, and it leads to inevitable controversy. So what are British values? We've often asked ourselves within policy. And who is to decide what they are? As one of my interviewees from my thesis research said, and I'll share it with you now, it's something that stuck with me. The person, one of my interviewees, who is anonymous, but a 28-year-old doctor from Birmingham, he said that, "I don't see how being British and Muslim, both as equally and fervently as the other, is such an issue these days. In fact, I'm only a good Muslim because I'm a good Briton. My British heritage makes me a better Muslim, simple as that." So this is just one of maybe 90 people that I interviewed, and what this sort of sentiment was echoed by roughly 80% of people, and in fact, the wording was almost similar. So let's rewind a little bit. The prevent policy is part of the contest strategy, which has been around for over a decade now. It was formed under Tony Blair's government. It's constantly evolving and definitely needs change. But the broader definition of extremism, as I mentioned earlier, many can see a positive light to it because it casts a wider net, rather than kind of, as Emman talked about prior to this, we kind of thought of people who are more pious looking or pious in belief were equated to radicals or down the path to radicalization. Whilst the newer definition incorporates it moves away from this reductionist argument, it could generate problems of its own. I mean, now for instance, even someone who holds quite strong leftist political beliefs, say a student partaking in anti-war demos, and holds anti-establishment views, can fall under this broader definition, and thus be deemed a threat to society. So, obviously, it creates a lot of ambiguity, and now the lines between extremism and terrorism are increasingly blurred. Moreover, as many of you know, there's the Channel scheme, which recommends people who are at-risk members of society to do radicalization programs. Speaking to people on ground within several different Muslim communities, I looked at London, Birmingham, and Gloucester. Many of the people I spoke to felt that their communities were being monitored or securitized. And you kind of think, well, why do they feel that way? What is it? Why are they so dissatisfied and disillusioned? I think it's essential when crafting these policies to speak to these people. It just seems logical, but often it isn't really done. Well, it could be more effective. So even the ex-MI5 chief, Maryyum Mehmood, branded Prevent as it stands today to be a failure. That's not to say, and I think I should be very clear about this, that's not to say that preventive measures are unnecessary. It's just the manner in which they're designed and implemented, that's the crucial element to their success. And now I could sit here and bore you to death with sort of examples of how Prevent has failed, but that's probably clear enough to you. You see it in the news probably often. But I will say one thing, this is something that struck me. In the past 4 years, over under the age of 10 were reported to de-radicalization programs. Now, it's kind of almost, it's upsetting and it's worrying that how have we let this happen? And also, what is radicalization? How can you effectively pick up radicalization or signs of it in a 4-year-old? It poses several questions. Ordinary members of, say, teaching staff or medical professionals who are now obligated by law to report people, essentially, how are they fully educated or equipped to make such decisions? That's not to say that, it's a very tricky and slippery slope. So, out of all of this, I think one thing is very certain. It's absolutely crucial to regain and rebuild trust amongst communities, and this was kind of what Emman picked up in her part of the discussion. As with other issues within communities, such as forced marriages or honor killings or FGM, what policy fails to do is engage with those most vulnerable. It is vital to take sort of a bottom-up approach, and by this I mean directly involving younger people, as opposed to what we see now, sort of a few unelected, unrepresentative, middle-aged men, self-appointed spokespeople of various ethnic and religious communities are called in and asked to help devise policies. Now, I don't know about you, but I feel this is obviously going to alienate young people further, rather than, speak to them directly. But I'll give one example, actually. This is quite amusing, of when government policies do try to engage younger people, fail. So, one instance would be, for example, the Met Police recently collaborated with a YouTube Muslim celebrity, sadly in the eyes of many young Muslim girls, a heartthrob. Adam Saleh, if anyone's familiar with him, he's probably, I'm just cringing at mentioning this. But, so he was essentially reeled in to head this campaign video dissuading youngsters from extremism. Now, with my academic hat on, I observed the reactions that some young Muslims had to this. Most scoffed at it, others found it insufferably cringeworthy. And there was almost this idea, I think, that amongst all of them, that Salah had sold out by collaborating with the Met. Now, this was almost, it just shows how difficult it is to reach people who just, don't want to listen or don't want to agree. So I raised this issue with Kamal Nutrishti, who's a prominent Muslim within the Met Task Force. And we spoke about this, not at length, but I just asked him, why is it that such initiatives, well-meaning and everything, are so badly received? Clearly, well, we didn't have, it was just a cup of tea, we'd never get to the root of this or have any answers or solid answers anyway. But one thing it does show is, not only is the current model that we have ineffective, but it's almost like we're preaching to a choir. Only those who want to listen will. So the next step is to engage those who don't wish to listen, and that's a hugely difficult task. I just want to end by reiterating my initial points about stigma of at-risk communities. The majority of British Muslims that I interviewed echoed the comments of one young man. So this is another anecdote or example that I'll give, and I'll finish off with this. So Shah, who's, again, the name's been changed, he's a 37-year-old Londoner, born and bred, who works in the city. This is what he had to say. I think being a British Muslim today means I have to prove a lot to others. It's almost a burden. I questioned Shah. I asked him, what do you mean by proving, and what is it that you want to prove, and to whom? He said, I just feel I have to prove that I'm normal. So that's the extent of things. I mean, the ordinary British Muslim, the majority of people who in my research, I deem them as accommodationists, so that's the strategy that they take, and I'd like to trademark that term. But my research is yet to be published. So what these people, when I spoke to them, essentially what they're doing is they're balancing, it's almost a negotiating act that they do with multiple aspects of their identity. Well, I came up with that term because speaking to people on the ground, they really despise terms like assimilation, integration. it felt for them as if things were being forced down their necks. It wasn't something that was natural or organic. Even though they might mean the same things, it's just policies have been using this terminology almost without even speaking to people. And essentially that's probably the take-home message from my end of the discussion, I think also from the rest of it. So when constructing policies like prevent, I think it's essential, and I'm going to say that we actually didn't talk to each other when we were constructing our talks, but I said that we should also avoid dehumanizing communities, so it kind of echoes a lot with Emman's point earlier. We must avoid dehumanizing those communities who in question, essentially, because ultimately one thing could lead to another, and anti-Muslim hate is pretty much on the rise at the moment, and what we have to ensure is that things don't get worse. So that's my end of it. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much to both of you. That's been very, very interesting. And also, I think we have a lot of questions. I would start with one. I think this is particular to Emman, first of all, but I'm sure you can also answer to it. So, as we all know, in February 2015, 3 school girls from Maryyum fled to go join the Islamic State. And what I'm wondering is, what attracts young British girls? I mean, you mentioned the values of honor and solidarity that might be attractive, and being not feeling included, as you mentioned as well. But they are aware that they will live in an environment of extreme violence and will be married to an older jihad fighter. Why is that? And then how can we, what are the bottom-up approaches that you mentioned? Despite dehumanizing, this is also a term that is quite broad. I can't really grasp what you mean with rehumanizing those communities.
Okay, so I think there's 2 questions there. So the first question on women. I am answering you, just looking outside the rest of the audience too. Basically, with women, I think it's caused a real a load of confusion because it's considered this new phenomenon that's happened with women suddenly being attracted to violent extremism. Actually, it's not completely new. There have been experiences, for example, in the Algerian Civil War, where women were attracted to joining groups and fighting. But to the extent that we're seeing it now, it is a really new phenomenon. And I think a lot of our understanding, and the reason why we always focused on men so much, was that we always saw men as more heavily politicized and more vulnerable to radicalization. But in reality, women today have exactly the same pressures, responsibilities as men do, and so they're just as vulnerable as men are to radicalization and to recruiters. But also, I think a lot of young women, they're still motivated by the humanitarian aspect. A lot of the young girls that have gone out and have spoken to the Channel programme since they've returned, we've actually had very, very few women who have returned, mostly because once you decide you want to come back, it's a lot harder for a woman to roam outside their house without being detected than a man does. But they tend to basically reference the Syrian humanitarian crisis as a reason for what made them go. This is a little bit different to the men who are a lot more angry about border politics. I think a lot of women, because the Syrian conflict has been so documented across the internet and across the media in a way that we've never seen with wars before, women have become just as open to this. It's become a lot more mainstream now to see images of children and families being harmed. And so a lot of women, I think, have been extremely naive. I think also, I often refer to the kind of age group that go into Syria. They tend to be of a specific generation. It's kind of how I term the 9/11 generation, or the post-9/11 generation. And this is something that both the boys and the girls have experienced, is that they basically are of a generation that has never really experienced a world before 9/11 and the war on terror. And I think the effect that the war on terror had, I think, has basically put Islam in the spotlight. And it started to create, I mean, I remember when 9/11 happened myself, being instantly more conscious of my Islamic identity. And I think a lot of young girls and boys both just generally feel that they have had to defend their religion in a way that they probably never did before, because they probably never even were that conscious of how different they were to their peers. And I think this had a massive effect, and you can see it because the generation of people who are going are of that generation, the world that they didn't see the world before 9/11. They don't know the context of the war on terror. I mean, I remember when, after the war on terror in 2001, you saw, so when the war on terror began in 2001, when the US invaded Afghanistan for the second time, basically, I remember saying to my dad, I had absolutely no idea what was going on, so I said, what's going on in Afghanistan? My father said, oh, they're going in to fight the Taliban. And I completely saw it as, from an Arabic point of view, Taliban in Arabic means 2 students. And I said, well, why are they sending the US troops, all these US troops, for 2 students? I mean, it's a bit much. So in that sense, before that, I wasn't politicised. I didn't know anything about my geographical heritage towards the Middle East and the Muslim community. But today, oh, that's a different story. You'll see 15-year-olds who know everything that's going on, and they have an opinion on it. You have to understand that that's going to have a huge impact on the way that they identify themselves as a British person and as a Muslim. And I think that's all about globalising identity, and women are just as vulnerable to that. I think people have talked about this idea of how brotherhood has been created with lots of young men, but with women, the sisterhood is also very strong, this idea that sisters can go out and they can be a part of this exciting utopian sort of vision. And there is a sense that that is just as compelling to a woman as a man. I don't think that the message is necessarily that you're going to get treated like a second-class citizen, you're going to have your freedoms limited. I don't really think about that when they decide to go.
Thank you. Would you like to add something?
Well, I do. I think Emman's pretty much covered it, but I think one element of it is this romanticized image of sort of, you have to remember a lot of the people or the girls who have gone are from certain sort of socioeconomic background, and often the family background that they come from is, it's very hard to articulate this, but almost in the sense that they're fleeing sort of the background that they're from, in a way that it could be perceived in a sense that what they have at the moment, fine, they have the education that they have, but within certain traditional orthodox family setups, many of these girls won't really have a choice in terms of, not all of them, but a few of them, like maybe quite repressed in terms of the choices that they have in terms of finding a spouse or something. You know, essentially seeing these poster boys, it could be almost like people look up to like celebrities in a way. This could be a way for them to kind of, firstly, move away and flee from this sort of mentality, and at the same time, it's almost like this cultish sort of celebrity personas that many of these jihadi